Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to I Hate Rock Music. And today I want to talk about the legendary television Brian Eno collaboration. And there's been a lot of stuff written about it over the years, and there's a couple of bootlegs out there that have the complete sessions. And I want to go over them again because I've read some articles, and there's a great little history of the sessions, which I'll post below. But I think they miss a couple points, and I also think the judgment of those demos has been a little harsh. And so a little background, of course, uh, the group started as the Neon Boys in 1973, so they actually have quite an early history of Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine working together. And most of the Neon Boys demos that have surfaced feature Richard Hell, including tunes that he ended up doing later in his own group. But the band eventually morphed into television by 1974, and with the dynamic duo Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine, and featured both of their songs. And so the band had done shows at CBGB's and the like, and had been garnering a lot of attention. And so one of the labels that was interested in the band was Island Records, and so they sent over a representative from Island along with Brian Eno to check out the band. And Eno had a lot of interest in the New York scene at that time, particularly the no wave scene, and he produced an album called No New York, and did a lot of production for a lot of or somewhat a production of bands like the Contortions and DNA and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. And so it's no surprise that Brian Eno would come across television, and apparently was quite captivated by Tom Verlaine's guitar sound. And so I hesitate talking about Eno as a producer because, as David Bowie pointed out, he doesn't really produce so much, although he's assumed the role of production over the years and has produced a lot of his own music. But at the time, he wasn't really a producer. He would come in the studio and guide the band, and sometimes add his odd twist to the music. And so he was more of a collaborator and a guide and a mentor than really a producer. And so the discussion of the Brian Eno television demos, uh, the disparaging remarks that members of television have made about Brian Eno's presence, seemed to be a little harsh but true, that Brian Eno wasn't necessarily in there doing a big production job on television. And so these demos, and let's remember they are demos, and so these weren't produced to be released. So therefore, to judge them on the quality of, say, television's finished work, eventual finished work, isn't really fair. They are demos, and the other thing is that Brian Eno didn't really mess with it too much. There's some keyboards on the version of Marquee Moon, some minimal keyboards that kind of really add a nice texture. But word has it that Brian Eno did not play those keyboards, although he might have been the one who suggested that they include it. And what I find interesting about the demos is that this is what the band would have sounded like in 1974. And when you listen to the Neon Boys demos, and then you hear a year later television's demos, it's not surprising they're a little punkier, they're a little more wiry, and a little weirder. And so I find these demos very satisfying. They capture that point in the band's history in 1974 with Richard Hell, and they had a lot different sound. And of course, they would be a little punkier with Richard Hell in the band. And let's remember that after Richard Hell left television, he ended up in Johnny Thunder's Heartbreakers. And so the Heartbreakers certainly became a lot better known after Richard Hell left. But that's his pedigree, from the Neon Boys to television to the Heartbreakers to Richard Hell and the Boydoids. And so he had that punk element that he brought to television. And it makes sense that after Richard Hell left, of course, they adapted more of a classic rock sound, and eventually created the album Marquee Moon, which bears no resemblance to anything Richard Hell would have done. And so one of my points I want to bring up is that, first of all, the criticism that Tom Verlaine apparently pointed at Brian Eno is that he made him sound like the Ventures. And I think that might be a little off the mark because I think they're produced really well, at least some versions that have surfaced now. I think the versions are pretty good, and it doesn't sound like the Ventures. It definitely doesn't sound like the television we've come to know. But the fact is that television before Marquee Moon came out released the single on Orc Records of Little Johnny Jewel. And if anything, it sounds more like a demo than the Brian Eno sessions, and sounds more like the Ventures. The guitar sound is very brittle and thin. It's very sparse, and it sounds a lot more like a demo. But they ended up releasing that, so I don't know if I necessarily put a lot of credence in Tom Verlaine's criticisms of Brian Eno's work on these demos. And there's 5 songs, and including the unreleased Double Exposure song called Double Exposure. And Richard Hell claims that his song Blank Generation was also included in those sessions, but it hasn't surfaced. So I'd really like to see these demos get officially released at some point. It's disappointing that the band is not interested in them. They haven't been included in any bonus tracks, and haven't been officially released, at least in their own package. It'd be nice because I find them really pretty satisfying, and shows a really great incarnation of the band. Let's remember this is 1974. The album Marquee Moon. They got 3 more years to refine their sound and hone in on what their actual values were and create the classic television sound that we know now, and the epic, monumental, one-of-a-kind television debut album Marquee Moon in 1977. So the fact that there's 3 years difference between these 1974 demos with Brian Eno and their first album per se, a lot of room for growth there, and a lot of room for development and refining their sound without Richard Hell. And so I think they're great to hear. Somebody on YouTube actually did a pretty good job cleaning them up and remastering them. I'm going to post those versions below so you can hear them very, very, very clearly. And an important addition to the rock catalog and rock history, these lost demos by Brian Eno. And I reject the fact that they're sub-quality. I think they're of their time, 1974, and they're pretty impressive for 1974. If these had come out in 1974, I assure you we would be having an even wider discussion about how important and how amazing television are. And then I also think that the production sounds pretty good to me. I love the way the guitars and all the instruments are recorded and produced on Brian Eno's first solo album. I see some affinity with the sound he got on the television demos, and I also think he brought out the guitar sounds of Tom Verlaine very well, and well he would, since he claims to have been so impressed with Tom Verlaine's guitar tone, which anybody would be. So anyway, that's my take on the sessions with Brian Eno and television. I think they're great, and I'm going to post below a really good, about 20-minute YouTube mini documentary on those sessions, and it fills in a lot more information, and it gives you a good reference point on some of the things I'm bringing up in this video. But television and Brian Eno, I think it's a good match. I wish they'd done a lot more work together. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.